At 10 a.m. on the 10th of October 1944, 3 American soldiers stood in the center of Aachen's destroyed Trierer Strasse. The silence of the ceasefire blanketed the war-torn street. As a white flag snapped in the wind above and shattered debris crunched beneath their feet, the 3 men stepped forward with an ultimatum: surrender the surrounded city or face total destruction by artillery and air power. The reply? No. The city's defenders would fight to the bitter end. In this video, using the latest technology and incredible wartime combat footage from these very streets, we'll follow the men of the 26th Infantry Regiment, block by block and house by house, through the battle for Aachen, the American Stalingrad. But before we follow the Americans into the city, let's take a moment to understand Aachen's geography. Once the center of the First Reich, by 1944, Aachen found itself on the borders of the collapsing Third Reich. The once mighty Siegfried Line had been breached, and with the dragon's teeth behind them, Aachen was literally in American sights. The US 30th and 1st Divisions enveloped the city from north and south, leaving only one tenuous corridor open for German reinforcements. Panning from east to west, Aachen is surrounded by rolling hills, and the landscape is dominated by the Lousberg in the north, where German artillery and observers monitored the battlefield. The Lousberg would become the main focus in the American attack in the battle to come. Using wartime aerial photography, we can get a sense of what Aachen looked like from above. To the west, here, lies the Cathedral and City Hall, past the Kurhaus Concert Hall and the Stadttheater. The above-ground S-Bahn rail line formed a defensive ring around the city. Here is the Hotel Quellenhof. Built in 1916, it once offered the height of luxury, but by October of 1944, it acted as the headquarters of Colonel Gerhard Wilk, commanding the city's defense. Wilk, a decorated First World War veteran, was faced with an impossible task. Hitler had declared Aachen a Festung, a fortress to be defended at all costs. To do so, Wilk had just 2,000-odd men, young boys and old men, ex-submariners and ex-Luftwaffe pilots, alongside some better-trained troops at the 1st SS Panzer Division. Supporting them were just 18 artillery pieces, 5 Panzer IV tanks, and a handful of other armoured vehicles. His plan? Draw the Americans into a brutal street fight in the rubble of the city. The attackers made good on their promise of a ruthless air and artillery bombardment. Aircraft roared overhead, dropping high explosive bombs, whilst ominous red smoke of the American artillery flares heralded the arrival of over 5,000 shells. The bombardment continued for days. As German civilians and soldiers alike cowered in sewers, basements and bunkers, the American 26th Infantry Regiment prepared for the assault. We'll be primarily focusing on the 2nd Battalion, headed up by Lieutenant Colonel Daryl Daniel, a South Carolina native. Perhaps surprisingly for a soldier, he had earned a doctorate in entomology before joining the US Army Reserves in 1926. Now, after years of war, his expertise in insects was second only to his experience on the battlefield. Daniel had commanded the 2nd Battalion since 1943 in North Africa and had led his men through the invasion of Sicily. After coming ashore on D-Day, he had been with the 26th IR all the way to Aachen. Jack Lieb, a cameraman, went with them. Though too old to be drafted, he volunteered to land on the beaches of Normandy and film the war for news agencies back home. Through the lenses of his 35mm and 16mm cameras, we'll follow the men of the 26th throughout the fight. The Trierer Strasse, just here, would have served as a rough dividing line between the 2nd and 3rd Battalions during the attack, with the main objectives being Hotel Quellenhof and the Lousberg. The men of the 2nd were to fight through the heart of Aachen, down the same route that those 3 men had walked days earlier. They would clear from the Rote Erde train station to Trierer Strasse, here securing St. Joseph's and Blücherplatz intersections, eventually reaching the Stadttheater, Kaiserplatz and Alter Kurhaus. 3rd Battalion was to clear the factory district. On October the 13th, the skies over Aachen were again blotted out by a massive air and artillery barrage 500 yards ahead of Daniel's men, whilst mortar companies showered bombs just 100 yards past the railway embankment. A war correspondent described the scene. I could see immense columns of smoke rising to the sky, where some 60 Allied dive bombers were freely forming up for attack and diving unmolested onto their objective. As the bombs came down, red jets of flame spouted up amongst the houses. At 9:30 a.m., 2nd Battalion's E and F companies stormed over the embankment of the Rote Erde rail bridge, taking German defenders by surprise on the heels of the bombardment. Because the railway bridge had partially collapsed and tunnels like this one were barricaded, American tanks simply charged the embankment at full speed, climbing over the top and flying down the opposite side, a risky maneuver for the crews. E Company pushed partway down at Adalbert Steinweg before moving east to support F Company on Stolberger Strasse. Simultaneously, 3rd Battalion launched their own foray into the factory district, I Company advancing along the railroad tracks while K Company pushed down Trierer Strasse. Immediately, the Americans ran headlong into the reality of urban combat. As the men of K Company advanced to this intersection, a 20mm flak gun approximately here pinned them down, pouring shells down the street. German machine guns and mortars at the same position fired down the opposite side of the street, pinning 2nd Battalion's F Company under a crossfire. As both groups of men took cover, concealed soldiers with Panzerfaust knocked out their tanks. German fighting positions were able to hold off multiple American companies, taking maximum advantage of the claustrophobic cityscape. When F Company entered the cemetery, they encountered ferocious resistance amongst the graves. One of the men killed was F Company's Captain Weeks, seen here on film by Jack Lieb earlier in Aachen. This sort of chaotic and confusing combat would come to be the hallmark of the battle. The tight angles and varying sight lines of narrow streets and broad boulevards would continue to be a problem. But the Americans would adapt in the days ahead. As Lieutenant Colonel Daniel put it, we quickly learned that in street fighting, strange to relate, one should stay out of the street. At 6 a.m. the next day, October the 14th, the 26th IR renewed the attack. 2nd Battalion was to reach Trierer Strasse and, along with 3rd Battalion, conquer the crossroads and occupy the cemetery under the steeple of St. Joseph's Church. The rest of 3rd Battalion would keep battling towards German headquarters at the Hotel Quellenhof. Dead were rudely awoken alongside the living that morning as F Company stormed the cemetery, with K Company providing covering fire from Perlisecker Strasse. Despite having lost their captain to German fire the day before, the men bravely fought between the headstones, eventually securing the cemetery. Standing on Adalbert Steinweg today, looking towards the Rote Erde railway bridge, we can see a busy thoroughfare. Here's the bridge and the iconic tunnel, which was filled with rubble at the time. As we turn towards the centre of Aachen, we can see the Tower of St. Joseph's, but do you notice anything missing? In this footage, notice how the corners of the building were blown out by American armour before they advanced past tight street corners. The building ornamentation on the street remains intact, looking identical to how it did at the time. Even in Aachen today, some of these corners remain missing, like lost pieces of an urban puzzle. Today's Aacheners drive past this very same corner on Gödelstrasse and Adalbert Steinweg, following in the tracks of those American tank destroyers. Let's keep following the men of the 2nd Battalion as they move down the street and turn west towards Trierer Strasse. Just down the road, we can see the very same church tower as American soldiers march past. One of them, Private Ragnar Lundgren, was filmed here on the corner of Oranienstrasse. He was born in October 1924 in Västerbotten, Sweden. Almost exactly 20 years later, he found himself with a radio as one of Daniel's E Company soldiers. If you look closely, the pockmarks and bullet holes remain, another reminder of the fighting that raged here. In this footage, we can see directly down Oranienstrasse behind Private Lundgren, where Lundgren and the rest of E Company made their way down this road. Now E, F and G companies began moving towards Trierer Strasse. Lieutenant Colonel Daniel remembered. As we were attacking to the west, and since our artillery was placed south, it was now firing parallel to the front. This permitted the artillery to fire very close to us without danger from short rounds. We found that shells could be dropped into the same block in which we were working. With delayed fuses, the shells would penetrate one or more floors before exploding, and the Germans would simply not stay in the buildings with that coming in. We could, therefore, mow them down as they fled. Despite all of this firepower, some buildings in Aachen simply couldn't be destroyed. Air raid shelters. Many bear the scars of battle today. This shelter, now a modern nightclub, still shows evidence of gunfire and high explosive rounds. When G Company came across one of these massive bunkers, they had no idea just how many German civilians and soldiers were stuffed inside. When G Company's Lieutenant Walker demanded surrender, the Germans refused. After marching a flamethrower up to the bunker door and sending a scalding surge of flame through the opening, the Germans quickly changed their minds. A journalist witnessed what happened next. The doors opened and out came the drabbest, filthiest inhabitant of the underworld I had ever seen. People came stumbling out into the light, dazed, then catching a breath of fresh air, started to jabber, push, scream and curse. "We've been praying every day for you to come." An officer remarked, all had been living like animals for several weeks. The ventilation and lighting facilities were inadequate. If one of us entered, he found himself suffocating in the stench-filled corridors. Incredibly, 75 German soldiers and over 3,000 German civilians emerged. While the fighting was over for them, there was still more to come for the Americans. By the end of the second day, 2nd Battalion had reached Trierer Strasse, whilst the 3rd Battalion reached the edge of Farvik Park. But how exactly did the men of the 2nd Battalion advance down these boulevards and side streets? Using incredible film taken during the battle alongside contemporary footage of the same ground, we can analyse the tactics used by Daniel's men in detail. Let's follow the troops and tanks of E Company on the 15th of October. Remember the damaged bridge and underpass at Rotterdam S-Bahn station? Thanks to American engineers, that tunnel was cleared, allowing tanks quick access into the combat zone. First, the battalion needed to secure the wide angles and long sightlines of the major boulevards. This would allow smaller assault squads to move block by block along the narrower side streets and compact apartment buildings. To do that, squads from Company E advanced down Edelbertsteinweg, turning left at the cemetery. Others turned down the side streets to clear the city blocks ahead of them. Let's take a look at Edelbertsteinweg. This main street leads directly into the heart of Aachen and had to be secured. The street is named after St. Adelbert Church, which can be seen just here. Long-range direct fire was the key to controlling this corridor. Lieutenant Colonel Daniel knew that covering these angles would both limit German movement whilst allowing his forces better attack routes into the inner city blocks. Looking at this footage taken during the battle, we can see an unknown lieutenant, likely from 2nd Battalion's E Company, looking down the boulevard towards the city centre, with the iconic church towers in the distance. As the cameraman, possibly Jack Lieb, looks across the street, we can see how the Americans took control of Edelbertsteinweg. Anti-tank guns provided powerful direct fire on German positions with a lower height profile that made them harder to hit. Just minutes later, a Sherman rolls up on the corner, now offering more firepower. The building behind the gun still stands today. It's the Aachen courthouse. And just here, firing from cover in an alcove of the courthouse, a 30 caliber Browning machine gun offered more fire to suppress the German infantry at the end of the boulevard. With the main road covered, small assault squads of about a dozen men and a few tanks or tank destroyers worked as teams in the narrow streets, which were simply too constricted for a larger force. Earlier, we saw the footage of Private Lundgren here on the corner of Edelbertsteinweg and Oranienstrasse. After that footage was taken, Lundgren and E Company continued down Oranienstrasse and then Sophienstrasse towards this intersection. One E Company squad advanced towards the centre of the intersection, coming down Sophienstrasse. As they approached, they had to look to their right to see the diagonal roads leading further towards the city centre. As fires raged, the Shermans turned the corner into the intersection opposite Luisenstrasse. Let's zoom out for a moment so we can see the intersection more clearly. Here is where we watched those tanks turning into the intersection from Sophienstrasse, looking directly across the roundabout towards Luisenstrasse. At the same time, another squad moved down Kongressstrasse, securing the intersection from two directions to reduce the risk of crossfire. The entire block was now surrounded and could be cleared by the troops following. American forces continued down Luisenstrasse as they cleared block after block. As we zoom back into street level and back in time to 1944, we can actually see where the 2nd Squad converged on the intersection, with armour providing crossfire protection. In this amazing footage, we can see squad-level tactics playing out in real time on the battlefield as a fire team advances towards Luisenstrasse. The cameraman stays behind the squad, frankly a smart move. On the left is the Geschwister Scholl School, which still stands to this day. Two Shermans advance side by side, protecting each other's vulnerable flanks. Infantry, following Lieutenant Colonel Daniel's earlier advice, stick to the edge of the streets, clearing buildings and windows from behind the protection of armour. Seconds later, the tanks unleashed their 75mm main guns at tall buildings ahead of them. This preemptive fire is another tactic to suppress and destroy any Germans who might be waiting to ambush them. As the assault squad moves further down the street, the tanks lay down fire, suppressing defensive positions just off camera to the left of the street. The infantry stay behind the tanks at walking pace, ready to jump into buildings if needs be. A shell smashes into a building ahead of them, sending debris and any German soldiers flying. Skipping ahead a few seconds, the cameraman has now crossed the street to get a better angle as the squad advances. Look carefully at the Sherman to the left. As the squad reaches an intersection, the tank preemptively swivels the turret to look down the road. We can actually see the tanks firing machine guns both straight ahead and down the side street. Moving slowly, street by street, these assault squads braved ambushes from windows, doors, and even sewers. By the end of the 15th, the Americans made it to Wilhelmstrasse. They were making progress. During the nights of October 15th and 16th, the German armoured column, including veteran SS troops, 6 assault guns and 2 howitzers, had entered Aachen here, running a gauntlet of American forces surrounding Reichsstrasse 57. As the Germans bolstered their defences, Lieutenant Colonel Daniel noted that enemy resistance became more fanatical. When 2nd Battalion tried to cross Wilhelmstrasse, Panzerfaust slammed into the buildings above them, using the falling debris as a weapon of its own. By the 18th of October, though, the end was nigh. That morning, Reichspropaganda Minister Goebbels broadcast a delusional message. The eyes of all Germany are on the defence of the ancient city by Battle Group Aachen. Your fight for the Imperial City is being followed with admiration and breathless expectancy. The few Germans left who might have taken him seriously would be disappointed. Despite the forced mobilisation of 125 Aachen police officers, the situation was dire. The Americans had unveiled another tactical innovation in urban warfare, the brute force of a 155mm gun at point-blank range. Normally, these huge guns, known as long toms, were used as indirect artillery, but now the guns would be used more creatively. At the corner of Rolandstrasse and Margaretenstrasse, 3rd Battalion's I Company rolled up a 155 long tom. It fired 15 shells into the Hotel Quellenhof, blasting a hole in the wall. At 10:30 AM, companies M and K made their way inside, picking through a maelstrom of discarded clothing, weapons, food and broken furniture. In the once elegant reading room, not one of the oil paintings of hunting scenes had fewer than a dozen bullet holes in them. M Company's Lieutenant Rashford described a wasteland of torn walls, shattered glass, bodies and bloodstains. The hotel, or what was left of it, was now in American hands. But where was Colonel Wilk? Wilk had escaped to a bunker here, embedded in the Lousberg, from which he issued a final order. The defenders of Aachen were now prepared for the last battle. Forced back into the smallest possible space, we shall fight to the last man, the last grenade, and the last bullet. I expect each and every defender of this venerable city of Aachen to do his duty to the very end. On the 20th, attempting to boost morale, he issued 162 iron crosses. It wasn't enough. The very next day, and despite his order, a parallel to the beginning of this story played out. But this time it was 2 captured Americans, Sergeant Ewart Paget and Private James Haswell, who crawled out of Wilk's bunker, white flag raised, to request on their captor's behalf an end to the fighting. Hours later, Colonel Wilk emerged too, to join the exhausted column of surviving German prisoners. The battle for Aachen was over. But the story of the city was not. Aachen would become the very first German city to fall to Allied troops in the Second World War, but at a horrific cost. One American lieutenant took a stroll through Aachen's shattered streets and recalled the scene. Not one building was untouched by the blasts of the saturation bombings or artillery strikes. The city is as dead as a Roman ruin, but unlike a ruin, it has none of the grace of a gradual decay. It is now of no historic interest, except as a lesson in the power and application of modern warfare. The human cost too had been enormous. In the greater battle for the city, 5,000 German soldiers lay dead or wounded, with a further 5,600 taken prisoner and perhaps as many as 1,000 civilians also paying the ultimate price, whilst losses to American forces, killed and wounded, approached 3,000. Today, Aachen remains a historic city with a renowned university. Life goes on, but if you look closer, you can still see the gaps in the cityscape, the places where new buildings replace old, and where the echoes of past battles still remain etched into the stone. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, why not check out our film on another famous urban action in the city of Cologne? And if you're interested in the history of the Second World War generally, be sure to check out World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, our dedicated podcast in which our hosts, Professor Matthias Thorn and Jesse Alexander, explore all aspects of the conflict from both the Allied and Axis perspectives. That's all this time. We'll see you again soon.